I was 16 years old the day they voted us out of the galaxy. I remember it because my father made me stand next to him at the viewing screen, even though I didn't understand half of what the assembly was saying. He wanted me to remember. He said, "Watch this, Myra. Whatever happens next, you watch it happen." 211 votes for, 6 against. Human delegation not permitted to speak in its own defense. That was the amendment that passed first, buried in procedural language nobody outside the chamber even noticed. By the time our ambassador realized what had happened, the vote was already closing. That's how it started. Not with a war, not with an invasion, with a piece of paper and 211 raised hands. I need you to understand what it actually felt like because the history feeds don't tell it right. They make it sound clean, official. Like humanity did something so terrible that the galaxy had no choice. That's not what I remember. I remember my father's hand shaking on the console. I remember the silence in our apartment that night, so total you could hear the water recycler 2 floors down. I remember my mother didn't cry. She just kept setting the table for dinner, over and over, like her hands needed something to do. They called it the Quarantine Accord. Officially, it was about the Keth incident, a research station lost with all hands, blamed on a human engineering team that had been working there 18 months prior. No trial, no evidence shown to the public. Just a finding, delivered from on high by the Kalveth Compact. The same 3 species that had run galactic trade and law for longer than Earth had known the stars existed. Humanity was young to them, 140 years since first contact. We were the newest member species in the assembly, still learning which fork to use at the diplomatic dinner, so to speak. And when the Kalveth decided we were dangerous, nobody with any real power stood up to disagree. Convenient, some said. Humans traded well below the price other species could match. Humans expanded fast. Humans asked too many questions in the assembly floor about resource allocation formulas that always seemed to favor the compact worlds. I didn't understand any of that as a girl. All I understood was that one day we belonged, and the next day we didn't. They gave us 6 months to withdraw every ship, every citizen, every research post from assembly space. 6 months to pack up 140 years of expansion. My father worked in orbital logistics on Ceres Station, helping route the evacuation convoys. He used to come home gray in the face, not saying much, just sitting at the table staring at nothing. "They're taking the beacon network," he told me once. "Every relay we built helping their ships navigate the deep lanes, they're stripping the identification code so it looks like we never touched it, like we were never here." I asked him why. He looked at me a long time before he answered. "Because if you erase what someone gave you," he said, "you don't have to feel bad about throwing them out." We left, all of us. Every human ship pulled back behind what they called the Veil Line, an arbitrary boundary drawn across 100 light-years of dead space, patrolled by automated Kalveth sentry buoys that would fire on anything with a human transponder signature that crossed it. Earth and her colonies, sealed off. Cut out of trade routes, cut out of the assembly, cut out of every piece of shared galactic infrastructure we'd helped build. They expected us to wither. I think that's the part that still gets me, even now, decades later, standing in a place I never imagined I'd stand in. They didn't just expect us to leave quietly. They expected us to fail. Small, fragile, temperamental Earth, alone in the dark without the galaxy's help, without its markets, without its technology transfers. Give it 20 years, the projections said. Human civilization would fracture, resource wars, colony collapse. A sad little cautionary tale told to the assembly's children about a species that reached too far too fast. That's not what happened. I won't stretch out the story of those years. You can find whole documentaries on the reclamation era if you want the details. I'll just tell you the shape of it. We turned inward and it hurt, and it built something. Every scientist who couldn't publish in assembly journals anymore came home. and worked on Earth's own problems instead. Every engineer who'd been designing Calvath cargo haulers for export credits started designing something else. Every soldier who'd served in the small joint peacekeeping units the assembly used to humor us. They came home too, and they didn't forget what fear looked like on an alien face when a human unit moved fast and moved together. My father used to say humanity had always had a strange talent. We're not the strongest species out there, not the smartest, not by raw processing measure, not the longest lived, but put a human in a bad situation with limited resources and a ticking clock, and something in us just locks in, focuses. We'd been doing that since before we had fire. The assembly cut us off from everything except the one thing we'd always had more of than anyone expected: time and each other. 31 years, that's how long the veil held. I was a grown woman by the time the first cracks in it showed. Married, a daughter of my own, working comms relay out near the edge colonies where you could still see, if you looked hard enough with the right instruments, the faint edge of assembly territory glittering out past the dead zone like a party you weren't invited to. We heard rumors before we heard confirmation. Ships going quiet near the Veil line. Calvath sentry buoys reporting contact and then reporting nothing at all. For a while the official assembly channels, the ones our listening posts still monitored, illegally, because of course we kept ears turned that direction, insisted it was equipment failure, space debris, aging hardware. Then one report got through that they couldn't spin. A Calvath border cruiser, the Ashendal Vanter, sent a distress burst before it went dark. Third-party observation, not us. A neutral trade convoy from a species called the Oruthi picked it up, and being neutral and mercantile, and not particularly loyal to Calvath pride, sold the recording to whoever would pay. We paid. I heard it myself, years later, once it wasn't classified anymore. The cruiser's sensor officer, voice climbing higher with every word, reporting a vessel on approach that matched no registered configuration in the assembly database. Then the captain, cutting in, demanding identification. And then this is the part that still raises the hair on my arms: silence. Not static, not an explosion. Just silence, like someone reached out and turned the whole channel off. We didn't know it then, but that was the day Earth came back. I want to tell you what those 31 years actually built, because the fear part doesn't mean anything without it. We built ships that didn't look like anything the assembly had ever designed, because we'd stopped trying to imitate their aesthetic the day they threw us out. Assembly ships were built for elegance, for status, for the kind of visual grandeur that told every other species at a glance how important you were. Human ships, by the time the veil came down, were built for exactly one purpose: function. Ugly, blunt, layered in redundant systems, designed by engineers who had 31 years of nobody watching and nobody to impress. We built weapons out of principles the assembly had abandoned centuries earlier as inefficient: kinetic systems, mass drivers, things that didn't rely on the exotic energy signatures assembly sensors were tuned to detect from 100,000 kilometers out. Assembly ships could see an ion drive spooling up from across a solar system. They couldn't always see a slab of tungsten moving at absurd velocity until it was already through the hull. And we built soldiers. That's the part I actually know something about, because my daughter became one. Her name is Sable, my husband's choice, some old family name, and she joined the Expeditionary Corps at 19, the year the first serious talk of the veil weakening started circulating through military channels. I remember arguing with her about it, screaming, if I'm honest. I'd grown up in the shadow of the exile. I didn't want my daughter dying to avenge an insult 30 years old. She looked at me with an expression I still think about: calm, certain, not angry at all, which somehow made it worse. "Mom," she said, "they didn't throw out a species. They threw out a family, every one of us. You, Grandpa, everyone who ever stood on Ceres Station and watched them erase our name off a beacon network we built with our own hands. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it so it never happens to anyone else. So the next young species that gets that same vote sees Earth standing there and knows somebody will come back for them. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The veil didn't fall all at once. It eroded the way something long-held eventually gives and then broke, the way something long-held sometimes suddenly does. 28 years after exile, a human deep scout crossed the veil line without permission, first contact, unauthorized, an accident of a navigation error, or so the official story goes. I've heard other stories. I don't know which is true, and honestly, at this point, it doesn't matter. What matters is what the scout found. A Calveth customs station, operating on the assumption that no human vessel had crossed that line in almost 3 decades, staffed by a garrison that had never seen a human in their lives. And what matters more is what happened after, because the scout didn't attack, didn't provoke, just observed quietly, and came home with 3 years of data on how soft, how comfortable, how unprepared the Assembly's border defenses had become in 3 decades of assuming humanity was gone for good. 3 years after that, we crossed the veil line for real. I was there. Not on the front line, I was 47 by then, working fleet logistics coordination out of the flagship support network, close enough to see the reports come in raw, unfiltered by the propaganda arms that would shape them for public consumption later. Close enough to hear my daughter's voice on the comm relay the night the first engagement happened. The Calveth sent a border fleet to intercept. 14 cruisers, standard doctrine, the same kind of overwhelming show of force that had made humanity fold without a fight 31 years earlier. They expected the same thing this time. A show of strength, a diplomatic scramble, maybe a token skirmish before humanity backed down and slunk back behind the veil where it belonged. That's not what they got. Human doctrine by then didn't look anything like the small, apologetic peacekeeping units the Assembly remembered. We came in dispersed, not massed, dozens of smaller vessels instead of a few large ones, hard to target, harder to predict, each one carrying enough kinetic ordnance to cripple something 10 times its size if it got close enough. And we got close. That was the whole doctrine. 31 years of studying every engagement report we could steal, beg, or infer, and the conclusion was always the same. Assembly weapons excelled at range, at elegance, at overwhelming force from a comfortable distance. They had never, not once in living memory, had to fight anything that was willing to close the gap and make it personal. Humanity closed the gap. I heard my daughter's voice that night, calling coordinates, calm as anything, the same calm she'd had in my kitchen the day she told me why she enlisted. Somewhere in the middle of that engagement, a Calveth cruiser captain, and this part is documented, it's in the official Assembly inquiry that came out years later because they investigated their own catastrophic failure, broke procedure and opened a direct channel mid-battle. Not to negotiate, not to surrender, just to ask, and I'm translating loosely here from the Calveth, what are you? And the human commander on the other end, a woman named Aconquires who I met once, years later, at a memorial ceremony, gave an answer that ended up printed on recruitment posters across 6 colony worlds. We're the ones you were afraid of before you ever met us. You just forgot. The border fleet broke within 40 minutes. Not destroyed humanity, even furious, even vindicated, held back from a slaughter it could have easily delivered. Disabled, scattered, humiliated. Word reached the Calveth home fleet before the sun rose on Earth the next morning. And within a week, the news had spread through every species in the Assembly that had spent 31 years telling their children bedtime stories about the dangerous humans who'd been cast out for the galaxy's own safety. Except now the story had a different ending than the one they'd expected. I want to slow down here, because this is the part people always want to skip to: the big battles, the fleet numbers, the dramatic reversal. But the part that actually matters, the part that made humanity's return mean something instead of just being a bigger stick than the one that hit us first, happened in the years after. In the negotiations. In the quiet rooms, the assembly convened an emergency session 8 months after the border engagement, terrified, scrambling, trying to figure out how to contain a threat they'd spent 3 decades assuring themselves didn't exist anymore. They expected retaliation. Some species, the ones who'd voted loudest for exile 31 years earlier, expected annihilation, and honestly, given what humanity was capable of by then, they weren't wrong to be afraid. Humanity didn't come to burn the house down. We came to knock on the door. Our delegation, and my daughter was part of the honor escort, which is a whole other story I might tell you sometime, walked into that assembly chamber, the same chamber where 211 hands had voted us out 31 years earlier, and instead of a declaration of war, they delivered a list of names. Every human who died in the collapse of the early exile years, the resource shortages, the colony that failed on Proxima B in year 6 because the medical supply chain the assembly used to help maintain simply vanished overnight. Every name. Read aloud, one at a time, for 6 hours, while the assembly sat and listened because they had no choice but to listen. Then our ambassador, a quiet man named Ademi Voss, not a soldier, not a general, just a diplomat who'd spent his whole career studying exactly this moment, said something I think about more than almost anything else from that whole era. We're not here to make you pay for what you did to us. We're here to make sure you understand what you actually threw away. You didn't cast out a threat. You cast out a mirror. Every fear you've ever had about what a species could become if it was pushed hard enough, denied long enough, isolated long enough, you built that yourselves. We didn't come back angry. We came back proof. The Colveth Compact didn't survive the fallout that followed, not through violence, through irrelevance. Species after species that had gone along with the exile out of fear or convenience started renegotiating trade terms, admitting privately what they'd known publicly for 31 years and never said aloud. The vote had never really been about the Keth incident. It had been about a young, ambitious, inconveniently competitive species that made the established order nervous, and a convenient excuse to make it go away. Earth didn't rejoin the assembly as a member state. We rejoined as something else, something the old charter didn't even have a formal category for until they wrote one. An independent power, invited but not subordinate, present but not obligated, welcome at the table but no longer required to ask permission to sit at it. I think about my father sometimes, watching that first vote with me when I was 16, telling me to remember it. He didn't live to see the return. He passed 4 years before the veil broke, still angry about it in that quiet, worn-down way people get angry about things they've made peace with but never actually forgiven. I wish he'd seen it. I wish he'd seen his granddaughter stand in that chamber in her dress uniform, calm as anything, representing a species the galaxy had once been so certain it could simply erase. I asked Sable once, years after, what it actually felt like standing in that room, facing the same body that had voted her people into exile before she was even born. She thought about it a long time before she answered, the same way she always did. It didn't feel like winning, she said. It felt like being seen, really seen for the first time. They spent 31 years telling stories about a monster they'd invented to justify what they did to us. And when we came back, we didn't have to be the monster. We just had to be exactly what we'd always been. It just turned out that was enough to scare them. I don't know how to end this story the way the news feeds do, with some tidy line about triumph or justice. It wasn't tidy. 31 years of exile left scars that a return, however dramatic, however vindicating, never fully closed. People died in those years who didn't have to. Colonies failed that could have been saved. My own father went to his grave still carrying the weight of a day. He watched 211 hands rise against everyone he loved. But I think about what my daughter said, standing in my kitchen at 19, before any of it happened, before she had any proof that she was right. That the point was never revenge. The point was making sure it never happened to anyone else. that the next young, ambitious species that stumbles into the wider galaxy asks too many questions, grows too fast, makes the old powers nervous, looks up and sees that somewhere out past the edge of the dark, there's a species that remembers exactly what it felt like to be thrown away. And remembers it well enough to make sure nobody gets thrown away again. The galaxy cast humanity out because they were afraid of what we might become. They just never stopped to ask what we'd become anyway, alone in the dark, with nothing left but each other and 31 years to get ready. I said I didn't know how to end that story tidily. Turns out I didn't have to because it wasn't over. Not really. What I told you was the return. This part is about what came after, the part nobody puts on the recruitment posters. 5 years after Ademi Voss stood in that chamber and gave his speech, I got a call in the middle of the night that I still can't talk about without my hands going cold. It wasn't Sable. I want to say that first because I know how these stories usually go and I know what you're bracing for. It wasn't her. It was worse, in a different way. It was a call from her commanding officer, a man I'd never spoken to before, asking me very carefully worded questions about whether my daughter had ever expressed doubts about her posting. Here's what I didn't know yet, sitting there in the dark with the comm unit shaking slightly in my hand. Earth's return hadn't ended the fear. It had just changed its shape. The Kalveth Compact was gone, or as good as gone, folded into irrelevance the way I told you. But irrelevance doesn't mean gone quietly. There was a faction, mostly old Compact loyalists, mid-tier officials who'd built entire careers on the exile being permanent, who couldn't accept what the return meant for them personally. Not politically. Personally. Careers ended. Pensions gone. An entire generation of Kalveth administrators who had structured their whole lives around a version of the galaxy that no longer existed. Some of them didn't take it well. There was a listening post out past the old Vale line, decommissioned technically, but still staffed, still quietly useful for exactly the kind of thing you don't put in official reports. Sable had been assigned there for 11 months, doing work she wasn't allowed to tell me much about, which I'd made my peace with the way every parent of a soldier eventually does. What her commanding officer was calling to tell me, in the careful, over-rehearsed way officers deliver bad news they haven't fully confirmed yet, was that contact with the post had gone dark 6 hours earlier. I won't drag out the waiting. I've had enough people drag out their waiting in stories told to me, and it never actually captures what it's like. It just makes you sit in discomfort for the sake of a good hook. I'll tell you plainly. It was 11 hours before I heard her voice again, and every one of those 11 hours felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. What happened, I found out later, most of it declassified eventually, because that's the strange thing about humanity's new position in the galaxy. We don't hide things the way the old powers did. We'd learned exactly what secrecy costs when it's used against you, was this. A splinter cell of former Compact officers, maybe 30 of them, had taken a decommissioned Kalveth corvette and gone looking for a target. Not a military target. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn. They didn't want to fight humanity's fleet. They knew better than that by then. They wanted a symbol. Something to prove to whatever remained of their shattered old order that humanity's return hadn't actually changed anything, that we could still be hurt, still be humiliated the way they believed they'd once been humiliated by simply having to share the galaxy with us. They found the listening post, 14 personnel, my daughter among them. The post wasn't built for a siege. It wasn't a fortress. It was a relay station, some sensor arrays, a skeleton crew monitoring old Vale line traffic that mostly didn't exist anymore. When the Corvette dropped out of transit 30 kilometers off the station's position and opened a channel demanding surrender, the officer in charge, not Sable, she was third in the chain of command there, young still, though she'd have argued that point with me, had exactly 2 real options. Surrender a station with no meaningful defenses to 30 armed extremists who had already demonstrated over the comm that they weren't planning on taking prisoners. Or stall. They stalled. I've heard the recording. It's part of the official record now, released 2 years after, once the political dust settled enough that Earth's government decided the story served us better told than buried. I'm not going to try to repeat it word for word. Some things you don't reproduce, you just tell what they meant. But I'll tell you what my daughter did, because I've had years now to sit with it, and I still don't entirely understand where she found it. She talked. For 40 minutes, she kept the extremist commander on an open channel, calm, almost friendly, drawing out every scrap of information she could. How many crew, what state their ship systems were in, what their actual grievance was, because somewhere in that 40 minutes she'd figured out something the rest of the crew hadn't. These weren't soldiers. They were angry men playing soldier, running on decades of resentment and half a plan against a target that wasn't as helpless as they assumed. While she talked, 2 of the station's engineers rerouted power from the sensor array into the old defense grid nobody had bothered decommissioning properly. Because that's the other thing about humans, we're bad at throwing things away even when we're supposed to. Redundant systems, layers on layers. It's practically doctrine now, and it started as a habit born from 31 years of never having enough to spare. When the extremists finally lost patience and moved to board, they found a station that shouldn't have been able to fighting back. Not winning cleanly, 3 of the station's crew died that day, and I think about their families more than I probably should, given I got to keep mine. But it held. Long enough for a response fleet, already quietly rerouted the moment the CO's stall tactics tripped an automated distress protocol, to arrive and finish what the extremists had started without ever meaning to prove. They'd wanted to show the galaxy that humanity's return was fragile. Instead, they proved, in the worst possible way, exactly the opposite. 14 people with no real defenses held a numerically superior armed force at bay for the better part of 2 hours through nothing but nerve, improvisation, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the situation was as hopeless as it looked. My daughter got a commendation for it. She never wore it to a single ceremony that I know of. She keeps it in a drawer, she told me once, because it's not something to be proud of, Mom. It's something that happened because I couldn't do more. That's the thing I think people misunderstand, watching these stories from the outside, cheering at the parts where humanity proves itself against the odds. The people living it don't feel triumphant. They feel like they survived something they shouldn't have had to survive at all, and the cost sits with them long after the galaxy has moved on to the next headline. But something else happened because of that night. Something bigger than my daughter's drawer with a medal in it. That incident, 30 extremists against 14 unarmed relay technicians, became the thing that finally, actually, ended the old order for good. Because the assembly, the real assembly, the species who'd quietly gone along with the Kalvath vote 31 years earlier out of fear or convenience, and then spent the years since humanity's return trying to figure out how to make peace with us without fully admitting what they'd done. They saw that recording. They saw 30 grown men, armed, trained, driven by decades of curdled resentment, fail to take a station staffed by 14 people, because those 14 people simply refused to stop fighting for each other. And I think, more than any fleet battle, more than any speech in the assembly chamber, that's the moment humanity actually earned something back. Not fear, not awe, something quieter and harder to fake. Respect. The assembly convened again, 8 months later, a full session, every remaining member species present, including several who'd been part of the original vote that cast us out. They didn't apologize, not formally, not in the way that would have made a cleaner story. Governments rarely do, but they passed something that mattered more than an apology. A formal recognition, written into the Assembly's charter for the first time in its history, that no member species could be expelled, quarantined, or exiled without a full trial, full representation, and a unanimous vote instead of a simple majority. They called it the Adami Voss Clause, after the ambassador who'd stood in that chamber years earlier and told them they hadn't cast out a threat, they'd cast out a mirror. He was there for the vote. I watched the recording of his face when it passed. He didn't smile. He just closed his eyes for a moment, like something heavy had finally been set down. I visited Sable last year, out at a new posting near what used to be the Vale Line. There's a monument there now. Simple, no statues, just a long wall with names on it. Every human who died in the exile years. Every name Adami Voss read aloud in that chamber, and more added since, including 3 from that relay station. She took me to see it at dusk, when the light does something strange to that particular stretch of stars, turns them a color that isn't quite blue and isn't quite gray. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying. Before we left, she told me something I want to end on, because I think it says more than anything I could add myself. People ask me sometimes if I hate them, she said. The ones who voted us out, the ones who sent that Corvette, and I don't, Mom, not anymore. Hating them would mean I still needed them to feel something, still needed the story to be about what they did to us. It's not anymore. It's about what we did with it. That's the part that actually belongs to us. I think about my father sometimes, standing there when I was 16, telling me to watch, to remember. I think he'd understand what she meant better than I do, even now. He watched the door close. She watched it open again, and then she made sure it stayed that way, not for revenge, not for pride, but so that the next time some frightened old power looks at something young and unfamiliar and reaches for the easiest, cruelest solution, there's a wall out past the edge of the dark with names on it, quietly saying, "We remember what that costs, and we're still here." The galaxy cast humanity out because they were afraid of what we might become. They never once imagined that what we'd become was the reason nobody would ever have to be cast out again. I thought that was the end of it too, if I'm honest. The monument, the clause, my daughter's face in the dusk light telling me hatred wasn't hers to carry anymore. It felt like a place a story could rest. But life doesn't close things up as neatly as we want it to, and there's one more piece of this I need to tell you, because without it, I don't think you'd understand what humanity actually became in the years after the return. Not conquerors, not even really guardians, not in the way the recruitment feeds like to frame it. Something stranger than that. Something I only understood myself once I watched it happen with my own eyes. 9 years after the relay station, I got invited somewhere I never expected to go. Not as anyone important, as Sable's mother mostly. A courtesy extended to family of Corps personnel present for what they were calling, in the flattened diplomatic language these things always get, a first contact observation assignment. Here's what that actually meant. A species out past what used to be the Vale Line, a young one, barely spacefaring, had stumbled into contact with a Calvath successor state, smaller now, humbled, but still one of the older powers with more ships and more history than the newcomers could hope to match. And the pattern was starting again. Committees, closed-door sessions, quiet talk about concerning growth rates and resource allocation formulas. The same soft, procedural language that had once ended with 211 raised hands. Except this time, Earth had a seat in the room before the vote happened, not because we demanded it. Because the new species, they called themselves the Ithra, small, quick, disturbingly good at mathematics for a civilization barely a century into spaceflight, had heard the old stories, heard about a species once cast out that came back and changed the rules. And when the older powers started circling, the Ithra did something nobody had thought to do 31 years before humanity's exile. They asked us to come sit with them. Sable was part of the honor detachment again, older now, quieter in the way people get when they've carried something heavy long enough that it stops needing to be spoken about. I sat in the observation gallery, An old woman by then, watching my daughter stand at the edge of a chamber that wasn't the one from my memory, but felt like its twin. The debate went on for 2 days. I won't walk you through every argument. Some of it was the same tired fear dressed in new language. Some of it genuinely thoughtful concern about a species growing faster than its neighbors could comfortably track. But every time the conversation started sliding toward the old solution, the easy one, the one that ends with a line drawn across 100 light years of dead space, someone would look toward the human delegation. Not with fear exactly. With something closer to caution. Like checking whether the room still had a witness who remembered what that solution actually costs. On the second evening, the Ithra delegate, a small, sharp-eyed creature named Vess, if I remember the translation right, asked our ambassador directly, in front of the full chamber, what humanity thought should happen to them. I remember the room going very still. The ambassador wasn't a Demi Voss this time. He'd passed 2 years earlier quietly at home, the way he'd always said he wanted to go, no ceremony, no fleet honors, just his family around him. His successor was a woman I didn't know well, younger, sharper in some ways, gentler in others. She stood, and she didn't give a speech about strength or growth rates or precedent. She said, "We think you should be given the chance to prove what kind of neighbor you'll be, not judged for what you might become." We were judged for that once. It cost us 31 years and people who never got to come home. We're not going to hand that same cost to anyone else, not while we have a voice in this room. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't unanimous. Old fears don't disappear because one species learned a hard lesson. But it went the Ithra's way, full membership, full representation, no quarantine, no line drawn across the dark. And I watched Vess, small and sharp-eyed, turn toward the human delegation afterward and do something I didn't have a word for until Sable explained it to me later. A gesture of their own culture, apparently, reserved for exactly one thing, acknowledging a debt that could never fully be repaid, only carried forward. I asked Sable on the transport home whether it felt different this time, standing in a room like that but on the other side of the fear. She thought about it the way she always does, slow and careful, like she's turning the question over to check every angle before she trusts it. It felt like the whole reason for any of it, she said. Not the fighting, not the border engagement, not the medal I keep in a drawer. This, a species that could have ended up where we did, getting to just be young instead, get to grow up instead of getting thrown away for growing at all. I think about my father again here at the end of this, the way I seem to every time I tell this story. 16 years old, standing beside him at that screen, watching 211 hands rise. He wanted me to remember it so I'd understand what it cost. I don't think he ever imagined I'd live long enough to watch my own daughter stand in a room like that one, not as someone being judged, but as someone helping make sure nobody else had to be. That's the part the recruitment feeds never get right, the part I've been trying to say this whole time without quite landing on the words. Humanity didn't come back from exile just to prove we couldn't be erased. We came back to make sure erasure stopped being an option at all, for anyone, not just for us. The galaxy cast humanity out because they were afraid of what we might become. What we became, in the end, was the reason fear stopped being enough of a reason to cast anyone out again.